Everybody stay calm.
He's a customer. He hasn't done anything. There is no issue here.
You're making a mistake. You walked through that door already looking at that table. You knew who you were looking for. Carter.
And the neon sign outside the copper kettle had been flickering for 3 weeks. Nobody fixed it. That was Harlow Creek for you. Maya Carter stood behind the counter at 11:40. On a Tuesday night, her white shirt untucked, her apron hanging loose, and the last customer had left 20 minutes ago. And chairs were on the floor. She'd stopped putting them up on the tables a few weeks back, and couldn't explain why. And just that the sight of chair legs pointing at the ceiling made the place feel braced against something, and she was tired of things braced against things. And the coffee machine was cooling down with that low hiss it always made at the end of a long day. Like it was finally allowed to exhale. She should have been home by now. She wasn't moving. Her phone sat face down on the counter next to the register, and it had been buzzing on and off for the past hour. She hadn't looked at it once. She stood with both hands flat on the laminate surface, staring through the glass door at the empty street beyond. And the jukes in the corner had gone quiet after the last song ended. It skipped sometimes, that jukebox, stuck on the same track and playing the same 8 bars over and over until someone crossed the room and hit it with an open palm. It had been doing that for months, and Ray kept saying he'd get someone in to look at it. He hadn't yet. Her hands were trembling, not much, just enough that she noticed, just enough to be annoying, and she thought about what she'd done that afternoon. And then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it wasn't going to change it, and she had learned a long time ago that there was a specific kind of exhaustion that came from turning something over and over in your mind after the moment had already passed, and the moment was gone. What remained was whatever came next. She picked up the damp rag beside the register and wiped the counter. Slow circles, and the kind of movement her hands knew how to do without being asked. Outside, Harlow Creek was quiet. The neon sign blinked. Red dark, and she turned off the lights and walked out into the Georgia night and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she remembered to check her phone. Then she wished she hadn't, because the number on the screen made no sense, and not the kind of number you associated with a Tuesday afternoon in a small diner in a town most people had never heard of, and she stood under the blinking sign and stared at it. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and started walking. She was already thinking about morning, about whether Ray had ordered enough eggs, and about whether the creamer dispenser at Station 2 was going to need replacing before the weekend. She was not thinking about the number on the screen. She was not thinking about what it meant. Not yet. That morning had started the way mornings in Harlow Creek usually did, and slowly, and without apology. The town sat in a shallow valley in central Georgia, far enough from Atlanta that nobody came through unless they meant to. 2 main roads, 1 traffic light that turned yellow too fast, a grain elevator on the north end you could see from anywhere, and a dollar store. A pharmacy that had been there since before Maya was born. A barbershop with a striped pole that hadn't spun since the previous election cycle. And the copper kettle, right in the middle of it all, on the corner of Decatur and 5th, and from the outside it didn't announce itself. Old brick-painted cream a long time ago, now the color of old teeth. And the sign above the door was hand-lettered, dark copper on brown, done by a woman named Patricia, who had since moved away to Savannah, and whose name Ray still mentioned with a kind of reverence usually reserved for people who had done something much more significant. And the window display changed with Ray's moods: a ceramic rooster this month, an American flag, a wooden coffee cup with a painted smile, and nothing matched. Nothing was supposed to. Inside, the place smelled like coffee and fried onion, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been running since 6 in the morning, and black and white checkerboard floors, worn smooth in the traffic lanes, still sharp at the edges near the baseboards. 6 booths along the left wall, 4 two-tops near the window, and counter seating along the right, 8 stools, one with a crack in the vinyl held together by a strip of electrical tape that Ray had applied 3 years ago and somehow never replaced. And Maya had worked here for 3 years. She knew where every crack was. She arrived at 7:15 that Tuesday, same as always, and unlocked the back door, and flipped the lights, and starts the coffee machine, and prepped the sugar dispensers and the napkin holders, and brought the chairs down from the tables and set them in their places. And she moved through all of it the way water moves through a familiar channel, not thinking, just doing, the body knowing the route. Ray came in at 7:40 with a cardboard box of biscuits from his cousin's bakery, and a face that said he hadn't slept well, and he was 48 years old and had owned the copper kettle for 11 years, and he wore the same style of flannel shirt in different colors every day, as if he had decided on that uniform once, and was not interested in revisiting the decision. And he was a compact, solid man, the kind built to last a long time. He didn't say much in the mornings, neither did Maya. That was one of the things that worked between them. She poured him a cup without being asked, and he nodded. They didn't need more than that. The breakfast rush started at 8. Not dramatic, this wasn't that kind of town, but steady and familiar. And Mr. Purvis arrived first, same as always, ordered 2 eggs over easy, and spent 40 minutes with a newspaper he'd brought from home. Then the county road crew, loud and good-humored, ordering everything with extra hot sauce and arguing about something that had apparently happened at a job site in Millbrook. Then Patricia Webb from the insurance office, who got a blueberry muffin and black coffee and said she was going to try something different next time. And she said this every morning. She never did. Maya moved between the tables, refilling, remembering someone's birthday, someone's sister's surgery, someone's dog that had finally passed. And she kept all of it in her head without writing it down, the way you keep things that actually matter to you. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular that morning. That was the thing about ordinary days, and you didn't know they were about to stop being ordinary until they already had. She was 26 years old, and people who didn't know her well sometimes took her for younger, something about the openness of her face, the way she still looked at things as if she were deciding what to make of them rather than assuming she already knew. She had grown up in Harlow Creek, and her mother Gloria had raised her, and her brother Ezra in a yellow house on Clement Street, 3 blocks from the corner where the copper kettle now stood. Gloria had worked at the county school board for 22 years, until her heart started causing trouble, and she was 54 now. And she took medication every morning and evening, and laughed too loud at bad television, and made sweet potato pie that people still asked about, and then worried about Maya in that quiet and continuous way that good mothers do. And it wasn't anxious worrying. It was the worrying of a woman who knew her daughter well enough to know that Maya would always choose the harder path when it was the right one, and that the harder path had a way of costing things. And Ezra was 22. He was in his 2nd year of IT at Caldwell Community College, 40 minutes away, commuting daily because the budget didn't allow for campus housing. And he was the kind of young man who could fix anything with a circuit board, went quiet around people he didn't know, and thought his sister walked on water, and was also, Maya suspected, more perceptive than he let on. He had a way of reading rooms that she recognized because she did the same thing, and she had never told Ezra about the scholarship. She hadn't told anyone. 5 years ago, a plain envelope had arrived at the house on Clement Street. Full scholarship, pre-law. One of the state's better schools, not 90 minutes away, everything covered. And she had sat at the kitchen table and read the letter twice, and then folded it along its original creases, and left it on the table, and gone to start dinner. 3 weeks later, Gloria had her first cardiac episode, and emergency room, 3 days admitted. Insurance covering most of it, not all of it. And Ezra was 17 then, still in high school, and the expression on his face that first night in the waiting room was the expression of a boy who had not finished growing and was being asked to carry something that should not have been his to carry yet. And Maya sent a polite letter declining the scholarship. She told herself she would find another way later. Later had not arrived, and she wasn't bitter about it. That was the truth, not just something she told herself to get through the day. She had made a choice, and it had been hers to make, and she did not need anyone's sympathy about the math of it. And what the scholarship had given her, even in its absence, was the preparation she'd done to earn it. And she had read and studied and kept reading after contract law and civil procedure and constitutional rights. and the structures that were supposed to protect people, and the ways those structures bent and broke and got put back together wrong. And she had carried all of that in her head for 5 years, along with Patricia Webb's blueberry muffin order, and Mr. Purvis's 2 eggs over easy, and in the name of the county code that governed what a police officer was and wasn't permitted to demand from a civilian sitting in a private establishment. The man in the back booth had first appeared on a Thursday 2 weeks before. Maya noticed him because of where he sat, and the far back left corner was the worst table in the house, and farthest from the window, closest to the kitchen, which meant heat and noise throughout the service. The overhead light back there had been burned out for a month. Ray kept forgetting to replace it, or kept not getting around to it, which amounted to the same thing, and nobody chose that table when anything else was open. He chose it. Somewhere in his early 50s, she guessed, though she'd learned not to trust her first guesses on age. Dark skin, a little gray at the temples, and a worn canvas jacket with too many pockets, the kind that had been washed many times and was better for it. A cap pulled low over his face, and he ordered coffee, black, and when she brought it, he said thank you in a voice that was quiet and very deliberate, and each word placed rather than thrown. And he didn't open a phone, didn't read anything. Sat with both hands wrapped around the mug and looked at a point somewhere in the middle distance, the way people look when they're thinking about something that isn't in the room. And Maya left him alone. That was its own skill, knowing who wanted conversation and who needed to be left to whatever they were working through. This man needed to be left alone. He stayed an hour and 20 minutes and left a $5 bill on a $2.50 cup of coffee and was gone before she got back to clear the table. He came back Monday, same table, same order, a different length of time, but something about the way he occupied space was identical to the Thursday controlled, deliberate, alert, in the specific way of someone who had learned to look relaxed without actually being it. And the third visit, she topped off his coffee without being asked. He looked up and said, "Thank you again." Their eyes met for a moment, and she had a thought she couldn't quite put into words. This man has seen something heavy, and he's still carrying it somewhere. She didn't push, and the fourth visit was the Tuesday that changed things. He came in at 11:40 in the morning. She was clearing table 3 when the bell above the door rang, and she glanced up, registered the cap and the jacket, felt something settle in her chest, the comfortable recognition of a familiar presence. She finished clearing the table, got the coffee, carried it back. That was when she saw the notebook. He had a small one open on the table in front of him, the cardboard cover kind, and he must have forgotten to close it before she arrived, or been distracted, or simply not expected her to glance down. She wasn't trying to read it, and she was setting the cup down, and her eyes went where eyes go when they're not being careful, which is wherever there's text nearby. She caught one thing, a name written in the middle of a line and underlined twice, Victor Rue. She set the cup down. He closed the notebook. And not hastily, calmly, the motion of a man who knew exactly what to do and when to do it, which was its own kind of answer. She went back to the counter, and her mind was already doing something she hadn't asked it to. Victor Rue. She knew that name. Everyone in Harlow Creek who paid attention knew it by now. And he'd been moving through the county for the past few months and making offers on properties, and some of them accepted, and some not. And he'd approached the Tillman building on 2nd Street. He'd contacted the owner of the old hardware store on 4th, and 3 weeks ago, and he had walked into the Copper Kettle on a slow afternoon and placed a business card on the counter in front of Ray, and said he'd be in touch about the lease. And Ray had picked the card up after Victor left and turned it in his hands for a long moment without saying anything. Maya had gone back to wiping down the condiment station. Neither of them had talked about it, but now there was a man she didn't know. A man who had been coming into her diner and sitting in its worst booth and ordering coffee and watching the middle distance, and his notebook had Victor Rue's name underlined twice. And she thought, that is interesting. She thought, that is probably none of my business. She thought, but the bell above the door rang at 12:17, 2 uniforms, and she heard the boots first heavy on the checkerboard tile, the sound of people not trying to be quiet because they'd decided quiet wasn't necessary. Then she turned from where she'd been standing at the coffee station and saw them. Harlow Creek Police. Officer Briggs was in front, and she had known who Calvin Briggs was her entire life, in the way you know everyone in a small town by accumulation, by proximity, by the stories that collect around a person over time whether they want them to or not. And he was 44, stocky. A voice he never turned down. He'd been on the force for 18 years, which in Harlow Creek meant he'd become a fixed feature of the landscape, like the grain elevator or the traffic light that turned yellow too fast. And she had seen him at the 4th of July picnic every year, at the town hall meetings Gloria used to attend, at the gas station on Route 9 in some kind of argument with someone. He was always in some kind of argument with someone. And behind him was Officer Vance. Younger, 38, quieter in the way that things are quiet when they're waiting to be told what to do. He had a habit Maya had noticed before. He always looked at Briggs first before doing anything himself. Checked in, confirmed, then moved. And she had seen both of them in the copper kettle before. Coffee and out. Nothing that felt like this, because this felt like something. And she understood it before she could have explained it the way they walked in, and the way Briggs's eyes moved through the room, and fast and practiced, and scanning and landing, and the slight recalibration in his posture when his gaze reached the back left corner. It was less than a second. It was enough. He knew who he was looking for before he walked through the door. They moved toward the booth. Maya set down the coffee pitcher she'd been holding, and she moved to the counter, slowly, like she was just tidying up. She kept her eyes on the back of the room. Briggs reached the table and put both hands flat on the surface, leaning forward, his posture the specific kind of large that fills a space on purpose. And hey, his voice carried through the whole diner without him trying. You got some ID on you? The man didn't look up immediately. He turned his coffee mug slowly on the table, once, the way you do when you are deciding something. And then he looked up at Briggs with the patience of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is prepared to be patient a little longer. I'm just having coffee, he said, quiet and level. I can see that, Briggs said. ID. Vance had moved to the side, positioning himself at an angle not quite blocking the path out of the booth, but making it clear that he was an option if the path needed blocking. The man said, I'm not doing anything, and you look like you might be. Briggs didn't shift, didn't back up. So let's make this simple. ID, we have a quick conversation. Everyone goes home happy. And the diner had gone quiet. Not dramatically, more like a room that collectively decides to stop making noise. Maya could hear the coffee machine's exhale, could hear the vinyl creak under Mr. Purvis's weight as he shifted on his stool, and she could feel her heart doing something faster than she would have preferred. She was already thinking about what she knew. What she had read, years ago, in textbooks she studied for an application she eventually turned down. And she was thinking about what an officer was and wasn't entitled to demand, and under what circumstances and what the absence of those circumstances meant. She came around the counter. Not fast. She was not running toward anything, and she walked the way she always walked through her workplace, even, unhurried, like she belonged to every inch of the floor. She stopped 2 feet from the booth. Officers, she said. Briggs turned. And that particular slow turn of a man who is communicating, that he's deciding whether to acknowledge you. And he's a customer, she said. Her voice was steady. She had wanted that, had pulled it down from somewhere that steadiness lives when you need it. He comes in regularly. He pays his tab and he doesn't bother anyone. There's no issue here. Briggs looked at her for a moment. And stay out of this, he said, not loud. The other kind of warning. This is my workplace, she said. Has he done something? Is there a specific reason you need his ID right now? And we determine what's a reason. You do, she said. And I'm asking what it is, because he's been sitting quietly in that booth since before noon, and you walked through that door already looking at this table before you'd taken 3 steps inside. The room was very still, and Briggs's expression didn't change in any way she could have described exactly. But something behind his eyes recalibrated. He hadn't expected her to say that out loud. Most people didn't say things out loud, and you're making a mistake, he said. His voice had gotten quieter, which was different from calmer. If I am, she said, I'll deal with it. Vance looked at Briggs. A chair scraped somewhere behind Maya. She didn't turn around, and she heard the sound of people sitting up straighter, of a room deciding which way to lean. Briggs took 1 step toward her, close enough that she had to hold something very deliberately in place inside herself to keep from stepping back. And Carter, he said. Just that. Her last name. Only that. And then he looked at Vance and something passed between them that she couldn't read, and he turned and walked toward the door, and Vance followed, and the bell above the entrance rang when they pushed through it. Gone, and Maya stood where she was. One breath, two. Then she turned around. She did not sit down. She went back behind the counter because there was work, and there would always be work, and the coffee needed refilling, and the checks needed running, and Purvis was signaling for his tab. She did all of it. She was aware of the room returning to itself slowly, like water settling after something has moved through it, and a woman across the room, someone she didn't know, passing through Harlow Creek, never going to come back, caught Maya's eye and gave her a small nod. Ray had appeared in the kitchen doorway. She didn't look at his expression directly, and she knew it would be complicated, and she didn't have room for complicated right now. And Carter. He had said Carter. She was not wearing a name tag today. She'd left it on the bathroom shelf at home that morning, and nobody had mentioned it because all the regulars knew who she was. But Briggs was not a regular, and Briggs was a man who had walked into her diner already knowing who he was looking for at the back booth, and who had then, on his way out, used her last name like it was something he'd pulled from a list, and she turned that over. She was still turning it when she heard the soft sound of movement from the corner and looked up to see the man in the booth standing, pulling bills from his jacket pocket, and he set some on the table without counting. She'd check later. It would be more than enough, it always was, and he looked across the diner at her. She met his eyes. He held it for a moment. Then he nodded, and once. Small, the kind of nod that means more than it looks like it means. He pulled his cap down and walked out. She watched the door. She thought, I don't even know his name. And the afternoon passed the way afternoons do when something has happened. And you're the only one who knows how large it is. Busy enough to keep her moving, quiet enough to keep the thing in the back of her mind pacing. And she poured coffee and cleared plates and smiled at people and answered questions about the special. And whether the peach cobbler was made fresh today, it was, and always was on Tuesdays. And underneath all of it, she kept circling back to Briggs, knowing her name, and the underlined name in the small notebook, and the particular quality of certainty in the way Briggs had walked straight to that table, and, like he'd done reconnaissance, like he'd already known what he was going to find. At 4, Ray pulled her aside. They stood near the supply closet at the end of the short hallway between the kitchen and the dining room. And Ray leaned against the wall with his arms crossed in the way he did when he was choosing his words carefully, which he did more often than people gave him credit for. Briggs came by this morning, he said, before you got in, and she waited, asked if anything unusual had been happening. Strange customers, anyone acting odd. Ray rubbed the back of his neck. I told him no. Then he came back at noon, she said. Yeah, she said. He went straight to the table, Ray. He didn't look around, and he didn't scan for anything. He walked in and went directly to the booth. I know what I saw. That's not how you behave if you're responding to a call or following up on something reported, and that's how you behave when you already know. Ray looked at her without answering, which was its own answer. Be careful, Maya, he said finally. She didn't push back on that, and she understood what careful meant. When Ray said it, it meant she had done something that had a weight to it, and the weight was going to land somewhere, and he was worried about where it would land. He wasn't telling her she was wrong, and he was telling her that being right didn't always protect you, and she went back to work. She closed at 8, and mopped, tallied the register, and left the deposit in the safe, and checked the back door lock. And Ray had gone at 7:30. She finished alone, which she'd done hundreds of times. She turned off the lights at 11:40, and she stood outside for a moment, in the Georgia night, the air still warm with the last of summer holding on, and she looked up at a sky that had too much cloud cover for stars, and she reached into her apron pocket and turned over her phone. She almost dropped it, not because of the missed calls from numbers she didn't know, or the texts from people she hadn't spoken to in years, or the notifications stacked so deep the screen couldn't hold them all, and it was the video. Someone had posted it. Shot from a corner booth angle, shaky at first and then steadying out. And the audio was clearer than she'd expected, and clear enough that every word she'd said to Briggs came through, and steady and precise, and clear enough that you could hear the silence in the room behind her, and clear enough that you could hear the one word Briggs said before he walked out, and Carter. The view count below the video was not a number she associated with a Tuesday afternoon in a small town. She stared at it. She looked up at the street. She looked back down. She put the phone in her pocket and started walking home. She didn't process the number, and her brain kept presenting it, and she kept failing to absorb it. She walked the 4 blocks to Clement Street without deciding to. Her feet knowing the way so well that her mind was free to do whatever it needed to with what it had just seen. And what it mostly did was go quiet. The yellow house was at the end of the 2nd block. Porch light on, the way Gloria always left it. And Maya had grown up calibrating her nights by that light if it was on. And someone was waiting, and not anxiously, and just attentively. And the way her mother did everything. And she let herself in through the side door, kitchen light on, Ezra at the table. And he was 22 years old, and he had their mother's eyes, and his own particular brand of quiet. And he was currently looking at his phone with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was remarkable because she had known that face since it belonged to a baby. And he looked up. "Maya," he said. "I know," she said. "Maya." He turned the phone toward her, a different someone else's angle, more stable, better framing. The view count on this one was higher. She set her bag on the counter. "How's Mom?" "Asleep." He put the phone down, and I didn't wake her. He paused. "Okay?" She thought about it. Ezra always asked questions he actually wanted answered, which meant deflection didn't land the same way with him. "And I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a few days." He nodded. That was one of the things she appreciated about him. He took her at her word. She filled a glass of water at the tap and stood at the counter drinking it, and through the window above the sink she could see the backyard, dark and still. The shape of the old magnolia Gloria had planted the year Maya was born. "It's more now," Ezra said quietly, and, meaning the Count. He wasn't excited about it. He was reporting it, which she appreciated. She didn't answer. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it, buzzed again. Then a third time, different from the others, not a notification sound, but a message sound. The specific one she'd assigned to texts from unknown numbers after 3 years of fielding calls from solicitors and appointment reminders, and people who had the wrong contact saved, and she pulled it out. The preview on the locked screen was short, and 4 words from a number she didn't recognize. "Thank you. Be careful." She stared at it. She thought about the man in the booth, his quiet thank you when she'd set down his coffee, his nod across the room before he walked out. And she thought, "He's never spoken more than 2 sentences to me. He doesn't have my number." She thought, "So who sent this?" She thought, "Prook, and why does it read like a warning?" She put the phone face down on the counter, and she said goodnight to Ezra, who watched her walk down the hallway with the expression of someone who had more questions and the good sense to know this wasn't the moment for them. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. She was not afraid, and that was worth naming because it surprised her a little. She had expected fear, and what she found instead was something more like alertness. The feeling of a problem that had just gotten large enough to take seriously. And she thought about the scholarship letter, the way she'd folded it along its original creases and put it in a drawer. And then later in the closet, and then eventually in a box she didn't open anymore. And the pre-law textbooks on the shelf in the back of her closet, which she still read sometimes when she couldn't sleep, not because she was torturing herself, but because the reading still made sense to her. Constitutional law, civil rights, and the architecture of accountability, how it was supposed to work, how it bent when the wrong people were holding it. And she thought about Briggs saying Carter, like he'd done homework, like someone had told him, "If anyone is going to get in your way in that diner, here's who it will be." She thought about the name in the notebook, Victor Roux, and she thought about the way Briggs had walked through that door already knowing. She lay back without taking off her shoes. The ceiling was dark above her, ants outside the window, and the first rain of the week started small drops, patient, and the kind that starts slow and doesn't announce whether it plans to stop. And she closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, she slept with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision without quite knowing they'd made it. In the morning, Harlow Creek looked exactly the same. And that was the thing about the mornings after things happened. The world had no visible damage. The traffic light still turned yellow too fast on Decatur and 5th. The grain elevator was still on the north end, and the dollar store opened at 8 the way it always did. The manager flipping the sign in the window and propping the door with the concrete block he'd been using for that purpose for as long as Maya could remember. She put on her white shirt, tied on her apron, and pulled her hair back, drove to the copper kettle, unlocked the back door, turned on the lights, started the coffee machine, and brought the chairs down from the tables she'd stacked them up the night before out of habit, the habit of 1,000 closing shifts, and set each one in its place. And the fifth chair she set down was the one at the two-top near the window, where the morning light came in best. She placed it, smoothed the seat cushion out of habit, even though it didn't need smoothing, and stood there for a moment looking at the empty table. And she didn't know his name, the man with the notebook. The man who had said thank you twice and paid too much for his coffee, and chosen the worst booth in the house 4 times running. And she thought, I'm going to need to know his name. Then Ray came through the back with biscuits, and the look that meant he hadn't slept either, and the morning crowd started arriving, and she moved back into the rhythm of the job, the way water moves back into a shape it knows. And she had learned a long time ago that the work didn't stop for anything, and sometimes that was the only thing that kept you together. She was refilling the sugar dispensers at 9:15 when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. And not a call, a text, same unknown number as the night before. She read it once. He knows who you are. She stood at the counter for a moment, with the sugar canister in one hand and her phone in the other, reading it a second time in case the first time had been inaccurate. And it wasn't. She looked up at the dining room. Everything normal. Mr. Purvis with his newspaper. The road crew laughing about something. Patricia Webb not trying the French toast, ordering the blueberry muffin the same as always. And she put the phone back in her pocket. She picked up the sugar canister. She kept working, because the coffee needed to be refilled, because the morning wasn't going to pause and wait for her to figure out what this meant, and because Maya Carter, and 26 years old, and who had read law textbooks in her closet and turned down a scholarship and spent 3 years learning every name and order and preference in a diner on the corner of Decatur and 5th, and had already decided something. And she was going to find out what this was, all of it. And she was not going to be scared out of wanting to know. And the jukes box in the corner started skipping again, caught on the same 8 bars of the same song, playing them over and over, waiting for someone to cross the room and fix it. She'd get to it. She moved to the next table. She kept going, and the first flat tire showed up on a Wednesday morning, and both front tires at the same time. Maya stood beside her car in the lot behind. The copper kettle at 6:50 in the morning, the sun barely clearing the tree line, the air still carrying that particular coolness that only existed in Georgia for about 40 minutes before the heat remembered itself and came back. And she looked at the front of the car, then at the lot around it, and then at the back wall of the diner, and where someone had spray-painted something in red that Ray had already gotten to before she arrived. She could see the scrubbing marks, and the ghost of letters that hadn't quite come all the way off the brick, and pale red against cream, and readable if you already knew what it said, and readable enough, even if you didn't. And she stood there for a moment. She was not going to cry about this. She was also not going to pretend it wasn't what it was. Both front tires, same night, same lot. That was a decision someone made. That was a message someone sent. She called a tow service and arranged a ride from Ezra, who answered on the second ring and didn't ask questions, just said he'd be there in 15. She went inside and turned on the lights and started the coffee machine and pulled down the chairs, and one by one. Same as every morning. Ray came in at 7:40 with biscuits and a face that meant he'd already heard or already seen or already knew, in the way that small towns always knew things before anyone said them out loud. He looked at Maya, she looked at him, and he put the biscuit box down and poured himself a coffee and stood at the counter. "You need anything?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. He nodded, and he didn't push. She wasn't fine in the sense of being unaffected, but she was functional, which in Maya's experience was close enough to fine to work with. The morning came and went, the way mornings did, and a few customers mentioned the video. 3 separate people told her they'd seen it, that she'd done something worth seeing, that they were glad someone had. She thanked them and moved on. And one woman, and a retired school teacher named Dorinda, who came in for tea on Wednesdays, and held Maya's hand across the counter for a moment without saying anything, and just held it, and then let go and went back to her tea. and Maya appreciated that more than the words. She had made the mistake of reading the comments 2 nights before, sitting in bed with her phone while the house was quiet. And the support was real and loud, and sometimes overwhelming in that complicated way, the kind of emotion that's too large for the container of a phone screen. But the other kind was there too, threaded through, reliable as weather. She should mind her own business, and she's going to regret this. And someone ought to remind her what happens to people who think they're something. She had read that last one 3 times before she caught herself and put the phone face down on the nightstand. She wasn't going to perform being unbothered. It bothered her. Of course it did, and she was a person. But there was a difference between being bothered and being stopped, and she had understood that difference since she was old enough to understand anything. She kept working. Victor Rue came in on Thursday afternoon, and she recognized him before he sat down, which wasn't difficult. Victor Rue was the kind of man who entered rooms like he'd already decided what they were worth. 50 years old, silver at the temples in the groomed way that suggested maintenance rather than time, tailored slacks, and a blazer that fit too well to be off the rack. His hands were smooth, the hands of a man who hadn't done anything with them in years, except sign things and gesture at things and dismiss things. And he sat at the counter, smiled at her. "Coffee," he said. "Black." She poured it without speaking. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked around the diner with the slow, unhurried gaze of a man calculating square footage. Then he looked at her. "You're Maya," he said. And, not a question, that's right, saw the video. He tilted his head slightly. Brave thing. She didn't respond to that. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded piece of paper and set it on the counter beside his mug. Pushed it toward her with one finger, not into her space, exactly, but in that direction. "Ray around?" "He's in the back. Might want to get him." She looked at the paper. She looked at Victor. She went to the kitchen door and told Ray someone was at the counter asking for him. And Ray came out and clocked Victor in about half a second and did the thing Maya had watched him do before, with difficult situations a careful flattening of his face and a setting side of whatever he'd been feeling and a preparation, and he was good at it. 11 years of running a business in a town like Harlow Creek had made him good at it. Victor unfolded the paper himself, slid it across to Ray. It was a check. Maya saw the number from where she stood and kept her face exactly where it was. And she was good at that too. The number was double the market value of the building lease. Maybe a little more. Ray looked at it the way you look at something that you understand and don't understand at the same time, and his hands on the counter were very still. "Final offer," Victor said pleasantly. "The pleasantness of a man who knows what leverage feels like and enjoys it." "Good for 30 days, Ray said. "I'll think about it." Victor nodded. He finished his coffee in 2 more sips, unhurried, and left a 20 on the counter, too much for a cup of coffee. Meant to be too much, the extra money, its own kind of statement. Then he folded himself back into his blazer and walked out, and the bell above the door rang and he was gone, and Ray picked up the check, stared at it. Maya picked up the $20 bill. She said, "Ray, can I photograph that before you put it away?" He looked up. "Just the check," she said. "The company name on it. I want to look at something." Shushed her for a moment, and she didn't look away. He set the check back on the counter and nodded once, then went back to the kitchen. She photographed it clearly, both the number and the company name printed across the top, and Meridian Holdings, LLC. Then she put the check back where Ray had left it and went back to work. She texted the photo to Ezra, the company name at the top, she wrote. "Can you find who actually owns it, not the registered agent, the actual person?" And he replied in 40 minutes. "Give me tonight." Gloria had a good evening. That mattered more than Maya could have explained to someone who hadn't lived inside the rhythm of her mother's illness, and good evenings weren't guaranteed. Some nights the fatigue came down hard, and Gloria was in bed by 7, and the house took on a particular thin quiet that Maya had learned to move carefully through, as if noise might break something, But Thursday night Gloria was at the kitchen table with a crossword puzzle, the television on low in the background with one of her shows, and she had made soup from the leftovers in the refrigerator, the good kind of leftover soup, where everything that went in was improved by being combined with everything else. And Maya sat across from her and ate a bowl and let herself have it. Just this. The kitchen light warm and even. Her mother humming at a clue. The smell of something cooked from scratch by someone who loved you. She didn't tell Gloria about the tires. She didn't mention Victor Roux, and Gloria looked up from the puzzle. You're quiet. I'm tired. You're thinking. Maya smiled in spite of herself. Those aren't always different things. Gloria made the sound she made when she agreed but wasn't ready to let something go. And Mrs. Patterson at the pharmacy asked me about the video today. What did you say? That's my daughter. Gloria looked back down at her puzzle, and that I wasn't surprised. Maya looked at her mother's hands on the table, and steady, a little thickened at the knuckles, the hands of a woman who had done everything with them for 54 years and kept going. She thought about what those hands had done for her, and all the things she'd never added up because adding them up felt like a kind of debt she couldn't pay. And, are you worried? Maya said. Gloria considered it seriously, the way she considered things. She didn't reflexively say no. She actually sat with the question. I'm worried about the kind of people who feel threatened by what you did, she said finally. Not about you. She looked up, and you know the difference between those two things. I do, Maya said. They sat with that for a while. The puzzle between them, the soup getting slightly cooler, the television saying something about tomorrow's weather, and it was a good evening. Maya didn't know it was the last uncomplicated evening for some time. Ezra texted at 11:15. She was in bed, not sleeping, rereading the same paragraph of the same book she'd been failing to get through for a week. Her phone lit up, and Meridian Holdings LLC Shell Company. Delaware registration, P.O., box address. Registered agent is a law firm that does this for 100 other companies, but I kept going. The registered agent connects to a second company, and second company connects to a third. Third one has a real name attached, an actual person. She sat up. She typed who he took a few minutes, then Nolan Hess, that's the name. I'm looking him up now. He's not easy to find recent stuff on, but older he's significant, and tech and logistics. Built something serious. His wife died about 3 years ago, and after that, he basically stopped being publicly findable. Last thing I can find is a charity event in early 2022, and after that, nothing. She stared at the screen. And a billionaire, and off the radar for 3 years, and was the real name behind a shell company, writing large checks to buy properties in Harlow Creek, Georgia, and through a man named Victor Roux, whose name was underlined twice in the notebook of a stranger who sat in her diner's worst booth. She typed, "Don't say anything about this to anyone yet." He replied immediately, "Obviously. You okay?" She thought about it honestly. "And I will be," she typed, and she put the phone down. She looked at the ceiling in the dark. She thought, there is something much larger happening here than a man being hassled over a cup of coffee. And she thought, I walked into the middle of it without knowing. And then she thought, with a steadiness that surprised her, good. Better to be in the middle of it than standing on the outside pretending it isn't there. The kicking out window happened on Friday night. Not the whole window, and the lower right panel, and the one with the painted coffee cup decal Ray had commissioned from a local artist 6 years ago, dark copper outline, and steam rising, and the kind of detail that made the place feel like someone had thought about it, rather than just opened a business, and a rock, or something functioning as one. And Maya found it Saturday morning, and glass on the sidewalk, and glass on the floor inside, and scattered across the tile in a radius, around one of the chairs she'd set down the day before. And she stood in the doorway and looked at it. Ray arrived while she was still standing there. He stood beside her without speaking for a long time. Then he said he'd call the insurance company. Then he said he'd call his brother-in-law about the glass. Then he looked at Maya. "And how much of this are you prepared for?" he said. It was a fair question. She didn't resent him for it. And Ray had run a business in Harlow Creek for 11 years, and which meant he'd navigated things she didn't have full visibility into, and made adjustments she didn't always understand, and kept the doors open through difficulties that had come before her and would come after. And he wasn't telling her to fold. He was asking her what she had. "As much as it takes," she said. The sound was almost a laugh. He looked back at the broken window. "Okay," he said. "Let's clean it up." And they swept together, him inside and her outside, working toward each other until they met at the threshold. It took 20 minutes. And Maya thought about the scholarship while she swept, which was strange. She often thought about it in moments of physical labor, some associative thing she'd never fully traced. And she thought about the civil procedure chapter she'd read 4 times, because the procedural rules around standing and jurisdiction had confused her until suddenly they hadn't. She thought about what it meant to know your rights in precise detail, and she thought about what it meant when the people supposed to enforce those rights were the ones breaking your windows. She swept the last of the glass into the dustpan. She dumped it in the trash. She started the coffee, and Sunday was when the floor dropped out. Gloria collapsed in the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon. Not dramatically, she didn't fall, didn't cry out, and she sat down heavily, and on the linoleum with her back against the cabinet under the counter, and one hand pressed flat to her chest, and her eyes very focused on the middle distance, in the way of someone redirecting all available resources inward. And Ezra was in the living room, and heard the sound of her sitting down, and, which was the wrong sound for someone sitting down, and called for Maya. And then Maya came in and found her there, and they got her to the hospital in 22 minutes. The ER doctor was calm, which was the most useful thing a doctor could be. Cardiac event, not a full myocardial infarction, the kind that sends a warning rather than a verdict. And they needed to keep her for observation, run tests, adjust her medication protocol. The language was careful and measured, the language of medicine that means, this is serious, and we are taking it seriously, and we are not going to catastrophize at you in this particular moment. And Maya sat in the hallway outside Gloria's room for an hour after they got her settled. And hospital hallways had a specific quality she had always disliked, the beige that was meant to be neutral, and instead became its own kind of loud, the fluorescent lights that flattened everything, the plastic chairs arranged in rows as if waiting were a group activity, and someone down the corridor was watching something on their phone without headphones. The sound floated down the hall, tinny and incongruous, and she sat with her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands. She wasn't crying, not yet. What she felt was bigger and quieter than crying, and it was the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding too many things for too many consecutive days, and has just been handed one more. She thought, I made a choice on Tuesday that had consequences. She thought, I know that. She thought, and I would make it again. And that last one surprised her. And she hadn't been looking for resolution in that moment. She'd been looking for a moment to just be tired without having to manage it. But there it was anyway. And sitting patiently in the middle of the exhaustion, and not asking for anything, and she would make the same choice again. She knew it the way she knew things she'd read and understood and couldn't unknow. Her feet had moved before her mind had caught up, because something in her had already decided, and you could not undecide in the way that mattered. And Ezra came and sat beside her. He had 2 vending machine coffees. He handed her one without speaking. She took it. They sat together for a while, the coffee going cool, the hallway doing what hallways did. She's going to be okay, he said. I know. And you don't have to manage it right now. She looked at him, 22 years old with their mother's eyes, old enough to say exactly the right thing at exactly the right time without knowing how rare that was. And I know, she said again. He nodded. They finished the coffee. Monday morning, Gloria's hospital bill was paid, and Maya found out when she went to the billing office after the breakfast rush and braced for the number she'd been doing approximate math on since Sunday night insurance coverage, and what remained, and how long she could stretch it, and whether she needed to pick up shifts somewhere. And she had a plan. It was a difficult plan. She had been carrying it in the back of her mind all morning, and the woman in the billing office looked at her file. There's a zero balance, Miss Carter. Maya looked at her. Someone settled it this morning. Cash equivalent transfer. Who? The woman turned her monitor slightly. There's no name on file. It was submitted as an anonymous payment, and Maya sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for 10 minutes afterward without starting the engine. Just sat with her hands in her lap and looked through the windshield at the parking structure across the way, and she thought about 4 words from an unknown number. Thank you. Be careful. She thought about a notebook with a name underlined twice, and she thought about a billionaire who had disappeared from public life 3 years ago and was connected, through layers of shell companies, to the purchase of properties in a small Georgia town. She thought, someone is watching this situation very closely, and she thought, that should feel threatening, she thought. Why doesn't it? She started the car and drove back to work, and Tuesday morning, 4 new tires appeared beside her car before she arrived, leaning against the fence post at the edge of the lot, still in the dealer's plastic wrap. No note, no explanation. Wednesday, an envelope arrived at the Copper Kettle addressed to Ray, and inside was a lease renewal for the building 3 years at the current rate, signed by a property management company neither of them had heard of, the signature clean and typed rather than handwritten. No personal name anywhere on the document, and Ray held the envelope and looked at Maya, and Maya looked at Ray, and neither of them said what they were both thinking. She had started a notebook, not on her phone, where anything could theoretically be accessed, and a physical one, small, and that she kept in the inside pocket of her jacket, not unlike the one she'd seen on the table in the back booth, and a detail she'd noticed and filed away. And each anonymous gift went in the notebook, and date, item, and method of delivery, and any identifying details, and, beside each entry, and a question mark, and because the gifts were answers to problems she hadn't told anyone about, and which meant someone had known about the problems before she'd said a word, and that was either protection or surveillance, and she wasn't yet sure which. It was Tommy Webb who gave her the beginning of an answer. Tommy had been part of the landscape outside the Copper Kettle for several months, and he wasn't a problem. He never blocked the entrance, never asked customers for anything, never raised his voice or caused any disturbance of any kind, and he occupied the bench at the edge of the lot, or sometimes the low brick ledge along the side of the building. He wore the same gray jacket most days, kept to himself, nodded at Maya when she passed, and once, early on in the months she'd been aware of him, she'd brought out a cup of coffee and a biscuit on a slow morning, and he'd accepted them with a formality that seemed like something left over from a different version of his life, and she had never asked his name. She had thought about that, sometimes the specific failure of not asking. It wasn't malice or indifference, and it was the accumulated habit of a busy life, the way you could be kind to someone every day and still not take the one extra step that would make them visible in the full sense of the word. She intended to fix that, and he came to the door on a Thursday morning, during the gap between the breakfast push and the lunch setup, and he knocked, which he had never done. And she opened it expecting a delivery and found him standing there with his gray jacket and his careful eyes and a small piece of paper folded in half, held in both hands, the way you hold something you've been asked to deliver and don't want to damage. He held it out. "And for you," he said. She took it, unfolded it, and addressed the far end of Harlow Creek, the older commercial block near the edge of town where a few buildings had changed hands multiple times and a few others had simply stopped being used and been left to figure themselves out. And below the address, in handwriting she recognized from a notebook glimpsed over a coffee counter 2 weeks ago, "He'd like to speak with you. Alone." She looked up at Tommy. "You know him," she said. "Long time, Tommy. He's a good man. And he kept a promise to me once when keeping it cost him something." A pause. "He wouldn't ask if it wasn't worth your while." She folded the paper and put it in the notebook in her jacket pocket, and then she looked at Tommy directly, and the way she should have months ago, and she said, "And what's your name?" And he looked slightly surprised, and as if the question were unexpected, and which it shouldn't have been, and he knew it shouldn't have been, and there was something in the small gap between those two things that made her chest tighten. "And Tommy," he said. "Tommy Webb." She put out her hand. He shook it. His grip was careful, calibrated in the way of a person who had learned not to take up too much space in any direction. "And I'll go tonight," she said. "After close." He nodded. "Tommy," she said, as he stopped. "Come in tomorrow morning if you want breakfast. Front door." He was quiet for a moment. "That's all right. It's not charity," she said. "It's breakfast. I offer it to people." And he looked at her for a moment longer than the usual beat. Then he nodded once and went back to the bench. She watched him go. She thought, 12 years he's been carrying something, and she didn't know that yet, not the specifics. But she knew how a person looked when they were carrying something that had been with them long enough to change the shape of how they stood. She knew that look very well. That evening, she was closing when a national news segment ran, and Ezra texted her the link at 8:15. She didn't watch it until she was parked outside the diner with the engine off. 3 minutes, and a producer had built it around the video, the cleaner and stabilized version someone had edited with commentary from a civil rights attorney in Atlanta who talked about small-town policing and accountability structures, and what it meant when ordinary people named what they were seeing out loud. And they said Harlow Creek. They said the Copper Kettle. They showed the front of the building from the street, which made it look both exactly like itself and somehow different, the way things look when they're being looked at by more people than they were built for. And she watched herself say the words. She watched Briggs turn away from her. And she watched the room behind her, the customer she hadn't been looking at, because she'd been looking at Briggs sitting up straighter, nodding. And that small groundswell of something she hadn't known was happening because she was too busy doing the thing to observe the effect of doing it. And she hadn't known about the room behind her. She sat in the parked car for a few minutes after it ended. Then she started the engine and drove to the address on Tommy's note. And the building was a former accounting office, and single-story, and dark windows, and the kind of place that had housed a series of small businesses over a long span of years and carried the subtle evidence of each one without belonging to any of them. And there was a light in the back, and she knocked. Darius Wells opened the door. He looked the same as he always had in the diner, the jacket, the cap, the deliberate stillness. Except that, in the diner, he had been maintaining the appearance of a man simply having coffee. And here he wasn't maintaining anything, and he was just a man in a room, and the room knew what it was. "Miss Carter," he said, "thank you for coming. Call me Maya," she said. "You've been sitting in my diner for 3 weeks." And something shifted in his face, almost a smile. He stepped back to let her in. The room was sparse, a folding table, 3 chairs, a lamp in the corner doing its best with the space. And in one of the chairs sat a man she had never seen in person, but recognized immediately from the single photograph that appeared in the first result when you searched his name. Silver-haired, 55. The particular kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. And he was dressed plainly dark trousers, a button-down shirt with the sleeves pushed up with the careful ordinariness of a man who had spent years being photographed and was making a studied effort in the opposite direction. East when she came in, and she stopped in the middle of the room. She looked from one man to the other. "All right," she said. "Who goes first?" Darius went first. He had been a federal investigator for 22 years, and he'd retired 4 years ago with a pension and a case he couldn't close. Not officially, the folder said closed. But Darius had the kind of mind that didn't file things as done when they weren't done. Not about this. The case was Harlow Creek, and specifically, and it was Officer Calvin Briggs, and a decade of what Darius described, and in the careful language of a man who had testified under oath many times, and as systematic abuse of authority combined with financial corruption, and not dramatic corruption, not the cinematic kind, the ordinary kind that runs quietly and reliably in places where the people it hurts most don't have the resources to fight it, and the people who could stop it have decided it's not their problem. Property intimidation and selective enforcement, coercion of witnesses through economic pressure applied at the right angles, and Victor Roux was the economic instrument. He identified acquisition targets and made offers below market, and when owners hesitated, and other things began to happen. And things like spray paint on back walls, things like broken windows, things like being called in for informal conversations with police officers who had nothing formal to charge you with, but wanted you to know they were watching. Darius had been building a new file, and, informally, and out of retirement, and through sources in Harlow Creek he'd cultivated over years, and people who trusted him enough to talk, and he used the Copper Kettle because it was central, public, unremarkable. People coming and going from a diner attracted nothing, and he had been careful, not careful enough. "Briggs knew I was there that Tuesday," Darius said. "I still don't have a confirmed source for how, probably someone watching my car in the lot, possibly someone who recognized me from years back. What he wanted was an incident, and something small. Something that could go into a police report as a behavioral problem, or a minor legal issue on my part. Something that would make my testimony inadmissible before I reached the stage of the investigation where it would matter." And he paused. "You stepped in before that happened." Maya sat with that. She said, "He called me Carter when he left. I wasn't wearing a name tag." Darius nodded. "He ran the employee records for the Copper Kettle about a week before that Tuesday, and Ray's lease documentation is in the county system, which Briggs has access to. Your name was on the paperwork Ray filed when he brought you on." He looked me up in advance, she said, and he already knew who might push back. You'd done it before, Darius said. Small things. Twice in the past 2 years that I know of. Once at the gas station, once involving a shop on 4th Street. Small interventions. But Briggs makes note of people who don't look away, and it's how he maintains the environment that allows him to operate. She looked at Nolan. Nolan Hess had been sitting with his hands folded on the table throughout Darius's account, and he didn't shift or look at the floor or perform discomfort. He just waited until she looked at him, and then he spoke. Darius and I know each other from 10 years ago, he said. I was the subject of a fraud investigation connected to a former business partner, and Darius ran that investigation. I was a victim in that case, not a perpetrator. The distinction mattered. A pause. We stayed in contact after it concluded. Another pause. When he told me what he was doing here, I offered to help, and logistics. Financial support. I didn't want my name attached for reasons that will become obvious. The shell company, she said. Yes, Victor Rue was engaged through one of my subsidiary structures before I understood the full picture of what he was doing in this county. And when I found out who he was working with and what for, I ended the relationship. He held her gaze. But the checks he'd written were already in the system. I should have caught it sooner, and that failure is mine. Maya looked at the lamp in the corner for a moment. She thought about a tow truck arriving on a Wednesday morning, about glass swept up on a Saturday, about a zero balance in a billing office, and tires wrapped in plastic leaning against a fence post, and about an envelope with no name on it sitting on Ray's counter. She said, the anonymous arrangements, the hospital bill. Nolan said, yes, you were watching the situation, and Darius was monitoring it. I was responding to what he reported. She nodded slowly. She looked at Darius, the texts. Yes, he said. Don't do that again, she said. Anonymous texts don't give me anything to work with. If you have information I need, tell me directly. And he looked at her for a moment, then understood. She turned back to the table. She looked at both of them. What do you need from me, she said. And Darius said, a formal witness statement, on record. And what you observed in the diner that afternoon, Briggs's behavior when he entered, and the directness of his approach to my table before any conversation occurred, and everything he said and in what order, and the absence of your name tag, and the fact that he used your name anyway when he left, and your account corroborating the pattern of conduct I've been documenting. And if I give it, she said, Briggs will know. Before the hearing, and, yes, which means what's been happening to the dine may escalate, Darius said. I won't tell you otherwise. She looked at Nolan. He said, I'm testifying, too, about the financial arrangements, about what I know of Victor Rue's operations in this county, and my name will be in the public record after this. I've been private for 3 years, a pause. That ends when this goes forward. She looked at him steadily. He didn't flinch from it, and there was something in his face she hadn't expected, not guilt, not the performance of conscience, something quieter. The expression of a man who has been careful for a long time and is ready to stop. She thought, his wife died. He ran from everything, and now he's here in a folding chair, in an empty building at the edge of Harlow Creek. She thought, people find their way back by different roads. She said, I need 24 hours. And they both nodded. She stood up, put on her jacket, reached into the inside pocket, and felt the notebook there, solid against her hand. She stopped at the door. One more thing, she said without turning around. The spray paint on the back wall of the diner, and the broken window panel. I need to know those are in your documentation already, Darius said. They are. Good, she said. She walked out into the Harlow Creek night, warm air, and crickets somewhere in the grass. A truck moving slowly down a distant road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the sky before it turned and was gone. She stood beside her car and looked up at the clouds. She thought about 24 hours. She thought, okay, and she got in the car and drove home and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open. And she wrote down everything she remembered about that Tuesday, the time she'd brought Darius his coffee, and the exact position of Briggs's hands on the table when he leaned over the booth, and the words he'd used in the order he'd used them, and the micropause when he first spotted the table, and the specific word Carter, and the specific absence of a name tag on her uniform. And she wrote it all in small, even handwriting, not stopping to reconsider or reframe, just what she knew. The way you write things you intend to be true. She wrote for 2 hours. At 2 in the morning, she capped the pen and closed the notebook, and she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Gloria was asleep. Ezra was in his room. The house breathed around her the way houses did when everyone in them was doing the same. And she thought about the man she'd stood up for without knowing his name. She thought about Tommy Webb on the bench outside. She thought about 12 years of a man carrying something she didn't fully know the shape of yet, but could feel the weight of. And she put the notebook back in her jacket pocket. She went to bed, and for the first time since Tuesday, she slept all the way through to morning. The federal building in Macon was nothing like what she'd imagined, which was strange because she hadn't specifically imagined it, but she'd expected something grander, more weight to the architecture, some visible sense that what happened inside those walls carried consequence. Instead, it was just a building, vague stone, wide corridors, an elevator that played music nobody had chosen, the kind of music that existed specifically to fill silence without requiring anything of anyone. She arrived 40 minutes early. Darius had told her to arrive early, and she had followed that instruction the way she followed instructions that came from people who understood the terrain better than she did completely, without revision. And she sat in one of the plastic chairs outside the hearing room and looked at her hands and did not go anywhere terrible in her head, which was a skill she had been developing for years without naming it. The ability to wait without catastrophizing, and the ability to stay in the room she was actually in, rather than the one her fear was trying to build. The preliminary hearing was not a trial. She understood the distinction precisely. And this was procedural evidence review, witness statements, determination of whether the documented conduct warranted formal federal charges. And Darius had walked her through it twice, methodically, covering each stage in order. And he was the kind of man who understood that people functioned better with the full picture, not because they needed reassurance, but because vagueness was its own kind of weight, and removing it was a practical courtesy. She had given her formal statement the week before, and a federal attorney named Patterson had taken her through it 3 times. Patterson was compact and efficient, the kind of woman who communicated through precision rather than warmth, which Maya respected because she did the same thing. And each pass through the statement was an examination not of Maya's credibility, Patterson had said, but of the statement's durability. You needed to know what you said held up under pressure before you said it under pressure. Maya had said it 3 times without changing anything, and because there was nothing to change. It was what she'd seen, what she'd heard, the time she'd set the coffee down, the direction of Briggs's eyes when he walked through the door, the exact words, in exact order, and the absence of the name tag on her uniform, the presence of her last name in his mouth when he left. Patterson had looked at her across the conference table after the 3rd pass and said, "You'll make a strong witness." Maya had said, "I'm going to tell the truth," and those aren't always the same thing. Patterson had smiled at that. Brief, real, the kind of smile that surfaces when someone says something you didn't anticipate. In this case, she'd said, "They are," and the hearing lasted 4 hours. Maya was called for 50 minutes of it, and she sat in the chair beside the table at the front of the room and answered questions from Patterson, and then from Briggs's attorney, and a man named Caldwell who had silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from having won arguments by outlasting people rather than outthinking them. And he tried to outlast her. He didn't get there. Not because Maya was combative, she wasn't, had no interest in being, and she was precise. She answered what was asked. She didn't speculate. She didn't reach beyond what she knew. And when Caldwell suggested she'd been emotional that afternoon and might have misread the situation, and she said calmly, and that she had not misread it. And when he suggested she might be remembering events in a way influenced by the attention the video had brought her. She said she had written her account down within hours of the event, and the written account matched her testimony. And when he asked if it was possible that Officer Briggs had had a legitimate concern, he simply hadn't communicated clearly. And she said the same thing she'd said the first time he'd tried that, and that Briggs had walked directly to the table before speaking to anyone in the room, and which was not the behavior of someone responding to an observed situation, and it was the behavior of someone executing a plan. Caldwell tried that particular approach 4 times. 4 times she said the same thing, and the 4th time he moved on. and she walked out of the hearing room and into the wide corridor and found Darius leaning against the wall with his jacket still buttoned, the same composure he carried everywhere, and the stillness of a man who had learned to wait in difficult rooms without it costing him anything he couldn't afford. "And how did it go?" she said. "You were exactly what was needed," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "And Vance broke last night," he said. She went still. He contacted Deputy Aldridge at 11:12 in the evening. He handed over 2 years of internal communications text threads, voice memos, financial records Briggs maintained on a secondary device, and evidence of the direct orders to damage your property. Evidence that Briggs accessed your employment records through the county system a week before the incident in the diner. He paused, and in documentation confirming that Briggs was aware of Victor Rue's role in the county before Victor ever approached Ray about the lease. And they weren't separate operations. They were coordinated. She thought about Vance in the diner, the way he'd positioned himself at an angle near the booth, not quite blocking, but making a point of being available to block, and the way he'd looked at Briggs before doing anything, the habitual check-in of a man who had spent years operating as an extension of someone else's decisions. He was scared, she said. Yes, of being left holding everything when it went federal. And yes, Darius said again, without judgment, just the fact of it. He'll likely see reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. That's how this works. And Briggs suspended effective this morning. Victor Rue was taken in on fraud and coercion charges. He's not cooperating. A pause. And he doesn't need to. Vance gave us everything. She nodded. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor. And below, Macon's streets went about their Tuesday afternoon cars, and a city bus pulling away from a stop, and a woman with a stroller navigating the curb, and a man eating something while he walked, 'cause he didn't have time not to. And none of it knew anything about what had just happened one floor up. That was the nature of things. The machinery of accountability made enormous sounds inside the rooms where it ran, and almost no sound at all outside them. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, and she thought about the spray paint on the brick that Ray had scrubbed before she arrived, the glass on against checkerboard floor. Gloria sitting down against the kitchen cabinet with one hand pressed to her chest, and the zero balance in the billing office. Tires in plastic wrap against a fence post. She thought about Tommy on the bench. Every morning, every weather. She took her hand off the glass. She turned around. "What happens now?" she said. And what happened now was 3 days of the specific nothing that followed something large. Formal charges took time. Court dates took time. The machinery, even moving in the right direction, made sounds that didn't feel like resolution, and it felt like waiting, which was different and harder in some ways than the thing that had preceded it. And Harlow Creek heard the news before any official statement, the way small towns always did through someone who knew someone in the county system, who mentioned it to someone at the barber shop, and then from there it reached the pharmacy and the dollar store and Patricia Webb's insurance office within about 6 hours. And by evening it had reached everyone who was going to hear it. The responses were not uniform. Some people were openly relieved. They stopped Maya on the street to say so, and they came into the copper kettle and ordered coffee and held her hand across the counter and said they'd known for years that something was wrong and hadn't known what to do with knowing it. And Dorinda, the retired schoolteacher, and came in on her Wednesday tea day and sat at the counter for 40 minutes and talked about a situation from years back that she'd never told anyone. And Maya listened, and neither of them mentioned Briggs by name, and others went quiet in a different way, and not hostile, more like people who had built their understanding of the town around certain fixed points and were now realizing the fixed points weren't fixed, which was disorienting even if the unfixing was right. And they came in and ordered what they always ordered, and tipped well, and didn't say anything about anything, and Maya didn't grieve either response. She wasn't going to perform gratitude for people being relieved that a corrupt officer was being held accountable. And she wasn't going to take it personally, that some people needed time to recalibrate. And she understood that accountability in practice was less like a door opening and more like a room slowly coming into a different kind of light. It took time for your eyes to adjust. She kept working, and Ray said something to her on a Thursday evening, after close, sitting on the counter stool while she tallied the register. "I almost took Victor Rue's check," he said. "I know," she said. I was this close. He held up 2 fingers with almost no space between them. And I know, Ray. He looked at the counter surface for a moment. You didn't say anything when you saw me looking at that number. You didn't try to talk me out of it. It wasn't my decision to make. That's not what I mean. He looked up at her. I mean, you didn't judge me for it. And even though you knew things I didn't, she stopped counting, looked at him. You've kept this place alive for 11 years, she said, and you had every right to protect it any way you could. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, You need more than a waitress job, Maya Carter. She smiled. She picked up the cash tray and went back to counting. Nolan Hess came in on a Saturday, not for any procedural reason, and not to deliver anything or collect anything. He sat down at a 2-top near the window, not the back corner, not a booth, just a regular table in the regular light, and ordered eggs and toast, and ate them like a person's eating breakfast. And he stayed an hour, drank 2 cups of coffee that Maya refilled without ceremony, and read something on his phone while the morning moved around him. He was still there when the rush eased, and she refilled his coffee a 3rd time, and he said, I'd like to speak with you when you have a moment. She said, 20 minutes. She came and sat across from him when the floor was covered, and he had both hands around the mug she'd noticed, that he and Darius shared that habit, and the same posture. And then she'd thought about it briefly the week before, and the way 2 people who had both spent long years being careful about everything ended up careful in the same ways. And he didn't open with anything preliminary. I'd like to make you a business proposition, he said. She waited. I'm going to be in Harlow Creek for the foreseeable future. The legal proceedings will take months, possibly considerably longer, and I want to establish something real here, rather than operating through arrangements that have no name attached to them. He set the mug down. The copper kettle has been losing traffic since the window incident. Ray's operating margin is thinner than it should be, and the building needs structural work. The roof on the north side has been patched 3 times and needs replacing, not patching again. I know, she said. I'd like to invest in a renovation, real renovation, structural, mechanical, aesthetic, in exchange for a management partnership. And he said it looking directly at her, nothing evasive in it. You run the day-to-day operations. I provide the capital. Revenue is shared proportionally. Ray keeps his ownership stake. I have no interest in displacing him. And he paused. This is not a gift, Miss Carter. It's a business offer. I would make this offer to anyone I believed capable of building something worth building. She looked at him. She said, What makes you think I can do that? And he said, You walked into a situation that had nothing to do with you, and for a man whose name you didn't know, and in a room full of people who could have moved first and didn't, and you did it without calculating the odds, and then you spent 3 weeks under real pressure without backing down or coming apart. He held her gaze. That's not a personality type. That's a skill set. And skill sets can build things. She sat with that. She said, I need 3 days, and he nodded. He left a fair tip, not too much, just appropriate. She watched the door close. She thought. 3 days, and she thought. But first I need to understand something I don't understand yet. Tommy was on his bench when she went outside on her break that afternoon. The September air was warm, but turning at the edges, the first suggestion of something cooler coming eventually, and she brought 2 cups of coffee. Tommy looked slightly surprised, which had become his standard expression around her, since she'd started bringing him things the expression of someone recalibrating what to expect. She sat beside him on the bench, and he accepted the coffee. She said, Tell me about the restaurant. He looked at her sideways. What restaurant? Whichever one you worked at before all this, she said. I can tell you were somewhere real. The way you look at the kitchen when you come around back. And you're not looking at something unfamiliar. You're looking at something you used to know. He was quiet for a while. Longer than a usual pause. The kind of quiet that had decision-making in it. And then he said, Harrington's. On Main, she knew the building. It was a wine bar now. Before that, it had been something else. Before that, she understood now. It had been Harrington's. I started there as a line cook, he said. 2007. Worked my way up over 5 years. And head chef by 2012. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. Best years of my working life. What happened? He looked at the street. The founder's son took over in 2012. And Young had plans. Wanted to bring his own team in, start over, a pause. He couldn't let me go without cause. I had a contract. So he created Cause. She said, "What kind? Money missing from the weekend deposit, twice in 3 weeks, and I was the senior staff member on shift both nights." His voice was flat, worn smooth by the telling and retelling and the long years of carrying it. He filed a report, and theft by an employee, and it wasn't you, it wasn't me. She said, "Was it ever proven either way?" "No charges filed." He looked at his coffee. "In a small town, that doesn't matter much. The accusation went everywhere. Nobody would hire me after. Lost the apartment 6 months later." And he stopped. Didn't finish the sentence because the sentence didn't need finishing. She said, "Darius investigated it." Tommy looked at her. "He was the investigating officer," she said, "and he found something." "He found part of something," Tommy said. He had records showing the son had been routing the deposits through a secondary account. Partial records, and he needed access to the county financial system to confirm the full picture, and for that he needed clearance from someone with authority over the case. A pause. Briggs had that authority. She understood then, not just the shape of it, the weight of it. 12 years. And a man who had built something real over 5 years of hard work, and then had it taken by a lie, and then had the investigation into that lie buried by the same person who had been burying things in Harlow Creek for over a decade. And she says, "I'm going to ask you something, okay? Do you still know how to cook?" He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face, not hope, exactly. Something more cautious than hope. The preliminary motion of hope, the version that hasn't decided yet whether it's safe. "And yes," he said, "I still know how." "Good," she said, "because I'm going to need a kitchen person. If this thing comes together the way I think it might." And she looked at him directly. "I'm not going to insult you by saying it's a place to start over. I'm going to say I need someone who knows what they're doing, and I think that's you." He was quiet for a long time. She let the quiet be what it needed to be, and he said, "What's the thing that might come together?" "A renovation," she said. "Probably a new name, new structure." She looked at the door of the copper kettle, the painted letters, the ceramic rooster Ray had put in the window, the brass handle worn smooth from 10,000 hands, and but the same corner, he looked at it too. "He's a new name. I've been thinking about that." "Keep the copper," he said quietly. "Change what doesn't fit anymore, but keep what's true." She looked at him. She nodded slowly. She said, "I'm going to look into your case and the Harrington's file. Briggs's records are being subpoenaed now. If the financial documentation is in there, it can be reopened." Tommy looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, and it took her a moment to name it. It was the expression of a person who had stopped expecting things, so completely, and for so long that when something arrived, it didn't look like what it was at first, because the shape of it had become unfamiliar. And he said, "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "That's not why I'm doing it." He looked at his coffee. "Okay," he said. She stood up. "And tomorrow morning," she said. "Front door." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." She went back inside. She called Darius from the supply closet during the last slow hour of the afternoon. He answered on the second rings. She said, "Tommy Webb, and Harrington's Restaurant, 2012. You were the investigating officer." A pause. "Yes," he said. "The file was closed." "Yes, Briggs." "Yes," a longer pause. "I've thought about Tommy Webb more times than I can count." "And I know you have," she said. "That's why I'm calling you instead of anyone else." "The subpoena, will it pull the financial records from that case?" He said, "It will pull everything in the county system that Briggs had access to or authority over. And if the records from the Harrington's investigation are in there, and I believe they are, because I believe Briggs archived them, rather than destroyed them, which was his habit, then yes. And it can be reopened." "How long?" "I'll make calls tonight." She said, "Good." She said, "Good night." Then she called Nolan. He answered on the third ring. She said, "I have a condition." He said, "Tell me." She told him about Tommy, and all of it, the restaurant, and the years he'd built towards something, and the accusation, and the buried investigation, and the bench outside the diner in every weather for months. And she told him the way she told things she needed people to actually hear, and without performance, and without softening, and just the facts in order. And Nolan was quiet when she finished. She said, "He's the head chef, full salary from day one, and when the legal process allows it, I want his professional record formally restored." Nolan said, "Done. No negotiation, no qualification." And she had expected the former and appreciated the absence of it. She said, "And Ray stays involved. His name, his stake. This doesn't happen by pushing him out." Agreed, Nolan said. She said, then yes. He said, I'll have paperwork drafted. And she said, Monday. He said, Monday. She hung up. She sat in the kitchen of the house on Clement Street, the lights low, the house quiet around her. Gloria was asleep. Ezra was in his room, and the old magnolia was dark outside the window above the sink. Just a shape in the dark, the same shape it had always been. She opened the notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote Tommy Webb, head chef. She wrote Monday, and she closed the notebook. She sat for a while longer in the quiet. She thought about the scholarship letter in the box in the closet, the way she'd folded it along its original creases, and the textbooks she still read on bad nights, not out of regret, but because the reading still made sense to her, still felt like a language she spoke and used every day even without the formal credential. She thought about what it meant to practice something without a title for it, and what it meant to use what you knew in the ways available to you and keep looking for more ways. She thought, maybe there were other roads. She thought maybe she'd been walking one without knowing what to call it. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and the renovation took 6 weeks. Nolan's team arrived the Monday after she said yes, and the project manager was a woman named Everly, who communicated almost exclusively through complete sentences and building codes, which Maya respected because it meant nothing got misunderstood and nothing got lost. And Everly walked the space twice on the first day and made notes, and asked Maya 3 questions and Tommy 4, and came back the following morning with a plan. And they kept the bones. The checkerboard floor stayed. They stripped it and refinished it, and the black and white came back sharper than it had been in years. The pattern visible again all the way to the baseboards. The counter stayed, and the booths got new cushions. Maya had stood in a showroom for 20 minutes going through swatches before picking a dark green that she couldn't entirely explain, except that it felt right, felt like something that would age well and look better for it. And the kitchen was fully reorganized according to Tommy's specifications, and which he gave in spare, an exact language prep station here, and cold storage there, and the current line configuration doesn't work, and Everly translated each one into structural terms without comment or revision. And the jukebox was the thing Maya had been quietly waiting for, and a technician came in on the 3rd week. An older man named Howard who specialized in vintage coin-operated machines and who approached the jukebox the way a doctor approaches something that has been treated by amateurs for too long, and he opened it up. He spent 40 minutes with it. He found a small mechanical fault in the track selection mechanism, a worn catch that had been causing it to stick and skip on the same segment of the same song over and over until someone crossed the room and knocked it loose. And a simple thing, he fixed it. He demonstrated by cueing 3 songs and stepping back while they played, all the way through, clean and uninterrupted. Maya stood in the middle of the half-renovated dining room and listened to all 3, and she hadn't realized how much of the background of her workdays had been that skipping. How accustomed she'd gotten to the broken version. How normal the interruption had become. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known she'd been holding. And Jude came in on the 2nd week of renovation. He was 19, lived 3 blocks from the house on Clement Street, and had been making art in various forms and places since he was old enough to hold something that made marks. And Maya had known him since he was small, a quiet kid, always watching things, always with something in his hand. And she'd seen his work on the back wall of the public library's parking structure, and a long mural of figures in motion, and rendered in a style that was both precise and loose, and the way things look when someone has practiced long enough to stop being careful and start being accurate. And it was good, genuinely good, the kind of good that didn't need explaining, and she had called him. She'd said, I need something on the wall inside. I want it to feel like this is a place where people stand their ground on, that not a slogan, not an image of anything specific, just that feeling. Can you do that? And he'd come in and walked the length of the wall twice, and stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, and taking in angles and light sources. And he asked 2 questions. How long is the wall? And does the afternoon light hit it directly? And she answered both. He said, can I have a week to work something out? She said, take 2. And he came back with sketches, not blueprints, and not a formal proposal, and just gesture and color on paper, and the way ideas look before they become decisions. And Maya couldn't read architectural drawings, but she could read energy, and this had it. Figures, not heroes, not anyone in particular, just people in ordinary postures, taking up the space they occupied without apology. And she said yes, that, exactly that. He painted it over 3 weeks, working evenings after the construction crew left. And he brought his own materials, and worked quietly with music from his phone, and did not seem to need company, which Maya appreciated because she understood the kind of work that needed to happen without audience. And she came by sometimes after close and watched him from the far end of the room without saying anything. She liked watching people do things they were genuinely built for. And the night he finished, he stepped back from the wall and crossed his arms and looked at what he'd made. She stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a long time, because it was exactly what she'd asked for, and also something she couldn't have described in advance. And the figures in the mural weren't performing anything. They were just there, in the light, standing in the space that was theirs. She said, "You did it." He said, "Yeah," and quietly. The voice of someone still deciding if they believed what they were seeing. They opened on a Thursday. Maya had thought about the name for the full 6 weeks, changed her mind 4 times, came back each time to something slightly different, and on the 5th week she stopped overthinking it and wrote down the 2 words that kept returning no matter what else she considered. The copper and kitchen, not clever, not reaching for anything, and just true what the place had been, what it was becoming, the material it was made of, and the purpose it served. And Ray had looked at the proposed sign and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Yeah, that works," which from Ray was the equivalent of a standing ovation. And she asked Everly if the sign could be copper-tinted letters on dark brown and the same palette as the original. And Everly said she'd handle it. And she did. And Gloria came in first. She wore her burgundy cardigan, the good one kept for occasions that deserved it. She walked through the door and stopped in the middle of the room and looked at the mural for a full minute without speaking. And Maya watched her mother's face during that minute. And she saw the moment Gloria understood what Jude had made, not just the visual, but what it meant and what it was a picture of. And she saw what that understanding did to her mother's expression. And she had to look away for a moment and do the thing she'd gotten good at, and which was not crying in the middle of something she needed to hold together. And Gloria found a table, the first booth, and the one nearest the window where the morning light fell best, and settled in, and arranged her cardigan, and picked up the new menu, and which was 2 pages, clean, and designed by a woman in Macon who Ray's wife had recommended. And she looked at it for a moment. "You kept the sweet potato pie," she said. "I kept the sweet potato pie," Maya confirmed. Gloria smiled, not the polite version, the full one, the one that took over her whole face, the one that meant something. Ezra was behind the counter, and he had offered to help for the opening week, unprompted on the Monday before. Maya had said yes before he finished the sentence, and he showed up on Thursday in a new apron, and still creased from the package, and had moved between tables with the loosened and slightly uncertain energy of someone doing something new and finding out they were better at it than they'd expected to be. And he spilled 1 coffee and apologized to the customer so thoroughly that the customer told him to stop apologizing. And then Ezra apologized for apologizing, and Maya heard the whole thing from behind the counter and kept her face neutral with significant effort. And Tommy was in the kitchen before anyone else. Maya arrived at 6:15, and the kitchen was already warm and smelling like 2 things coffee, and something baking that wasn't on any previous version of the menu. "And what is that?" she said through the pass-through. "Jalapeno cornbread," he said without looking up from the prep station. "I had an idea last night. Is that going on the menu? Depends on this morning." She looked at the loaves cooling on the rack. "Make extra," she said, and they were full from 8 to 11 without a break in service. Word had traveled in that particular way. Small towns moved information not through any single channel, but through all of them simultaneously, so that everyone seemed to know at once, like weather arriving. And some people came for the food, some came to see the mural, some came because they had been waiting for a reason to show up, and now there was one. And a few came because they felt guilty about the months they'd kept their heads down, and showing up on opening day was the closest thing available to an apology. Maya didn't rank the reasons. She just made sure everyone got coffee. Aldridge came in at 11:15, and not in uniform, and dark jacket, civilian clothes, the practiced ordinariness of someone used to moving through spaces without drawing attention. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the mural, then found a stool at the counter. Maya brought her coffee without being asked, and Aldridge looked at the counter. She said, "How are you doing?" Maya said, "Better than a month ago, that's honest. I specialize." Aldridge almost smiled. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "The formal charges against Briggs were filed this morning, and I wanted you to hear it from me before the news cycle picked it up." Maya set the coffee pot down. "Vance's cooperation has been comprehensive," Aldridge said. "The charges are federal corruption, civil rights violations, coercion across multiple instances over multiple years, and it will be a long process. There'll be delays, continuances, a full defense mounted. Caldwell is already involved." "I know how it works," Maya said. "I know you do." Aldridge looked at her. "And I just wanted you to understand that today is the beginning of a process, not the end of one." Maya nodded. Aldridge folded her hands around the mug. She said, "You went to law school?" "Almost," Maya said. "And then, because the morning was good and the light was right." And she had been keeping things in the closet for 5 years, and was tired of the closet. "I had a scholarship. Full ride, pre-law. I turned it down, and my mother needed me," Aldridge said. "And now?" Maya looked at the room. Ezra carrying 2 plates and handling it with more ease than she'd expected, the mural on the wall, and Tommy visible through the pass-through, moving through his kitchen with the efficiency of someone, returned to their natural environment, and Gloria in the first booth with her sweet potato pie and her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, reading something on her phone with the focused pleasure of a woman who was where she wanted to be. And she said, "Now I think I found a different way in. I just didn't have a name for it until recently." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then she took something from her jacket pocket. A card folded once. She set it on the counter without a word, and Maya picked it up after Aldridge left. It was a program card, paralegal certification, affiliated with the Macon County court system, evening and weekend sessions, open enrollment. On the back of the card, in small, even handwriting, 3 words, "And you'd be good." Maya held the card for a moment. Then she tucked it into her jacket pocket next to the notebook. Darius came back on a Friday, the same booth. Nobody else chose it. Maybe nobody else ever would. And there was something about that corner, the dim light, and the kitchen proximity, and the way it sat apart from everything else in the room that had become his in some permanent way, and the way certain seats in certain places become associated with certain people, even after they're gone. And he wasn't gone, but the association held. She brought the coffee. He looked up at her. "Tommy's file," he said. "Tell me," she said. The subpoena pulled everything in the county archive that Briggs had authority over, and the Harrington's investigation files were in a subdirectory he'd created for case materials he considered resolved. A pause. He'd archived them, not deleted them, which was either arrogance or habit or both. The financial records are there, and the routing of the weekend deposits through the Sun's secondary account is documented across 6 transactions. And another pause. It's not partial anymore. It's complete. She stood with the coffee pot in her hand. She said, "What does that mean for Tommy?" "Formal exoneration. A filing with the county clerk's office restoring his professional record and documenting the original report as false." And he looked at her steadily. "I made the calls last night. The filing goes through next week. Tommy will be notified directly by the clerk. 12 years. She thought about that. And 12 years on the other side of something that should have been fixed in 12 weeks. 12 years of carrying the wrong shape of a story about yourself, the one someone else had written and then handed you and told you was the truth." She said, "He's in the kitchen." "And I know," Darius said. "I saw him through the pass-through when I came in." She said, "Will you tell him?" He looked at her. "It should come from you," she said. "And you were there 12 years ago. He deserves to hear it from the person who didn't let it go." Darius looked at his coffee. He stood up, and he walked to the kitchen window, the pass-through, and the small rectangular opening through which orders traveled, and voices carried, and sometimes, and on slow mornings, and whole conversations happened, without anyone being in the same room. And he said, "Tommy." Tommy looked up from the prep station. "Can you step out for a minute?" And Tommy wiped his hands on his apron. He came around through the side door, into the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the dining room. Darius met him there. Maya went behind the counter. She didn't watch. She didn't need to. and she focused on the dining room, Ezra refilling waters, the morning crowd beginning to thin toward the late morning lull, the jukebox playing something slow and clean all the way through without skipping. She kept her hands moving, and she kept her face where she wanted it. She heard nothing specific from the hallway. She didn't need specifics. After a while, Tommy came back through the kitchen door. She could see him through the pass-through, and he stood at the prep station with his back to her for a moment, completely still. Then he picked up his knife and went back to work. His back was straighter. She noticed that. She filed it away in the place where she kept things that mattered, and the lunch rush came in, and she moved into it, and the morning became afternoon, and the afternoon became the particular quiet that settled over the diner in the hour before the early dinner crowd. When the room held mostly the regulars who came for coffee and a place to sit, and Nolan came in around 3. He sat at the window table again, his table now, she supposed, the way Darius had his corner, and he ordered the jalapeno cornbread, which had gone on the menu the day after opening, and which Ray had claimed to have discovered, a revision of history that Maya allowed because it was harmless, and because Ray looked quietly proud every time someone ordered it, and Nolan ate it with the expression of a man who had expected to like it and was satisfied to be right. He looked at the mural. He said, "The kid who painted that, Jude," she said. "There's a wall at the community center that's been bare for as long as I've been in this county, and I'd like to make a call if you think he'd be interested." She thought about Jude standing in front of the finished mural with his arms crossed, still deciding if he believed what he'd made, and she said, "I'll ask him." Nolan finished the cornbread. He looked at her with the steady, undramatic directness she had gotten used to from him. He said, "You're going to be fine." She said, "I know," and she did know, not the loud, performative kind of knowing, the quiet kind, and the kind that lives in the body, in the place below language, and doesn't need to announce itself because it's simply there. The knowing of a person who has done something hard and is still standing after it and understands, in some cellular way, that this is what she's built of, and that the next hard thing will come, because it always did, and she will do what she always did. She will figure it out. She will keep going. And she locked up on that same Thursday evening, the first day, after everyone had gone, and the dining room was quiet, and the kitchen was clean, and the last of the afternoon light had moved off the mural and left it in the softer illumination of the overhead fixtures. And she did the closing the way she always had, and coffee machine down, till counted. Back door checked twice, chairs left on the floor, the way she'd stopped stacking them weeks ago, because she didn't want this place to look braced against anything ever again. She stood behind the counter. She looked at the room, and she thought about Briggs saying Carter in the voice of a man reading from a list, about glass on the checkerboard floor, about a zero balance on a screen in a billing office, about Tommy standing at his prep station with a straighter back, and about Aldridge's card in her jacket pocket next to the notebook. She thought about the scholarship letter in the box in the closet. She thought, maybe the road wasn't a straight line. Maybe it never was. And maybe you took the turn that was available and found out later what it had been a turn toward. The bell above the door rang. She turned. Darius. She raised an eyebrow. "We're closed." "I saw the light," he said. She looked at him, and he came in and sat down at the counter. Not the back corner. The counter, the end stool, the one nearest the window where the late light came through. Out in the open, no shadows where anyone walking past could see him. "Coffee's off," she said. "That's all right," he said, and she came around and sat on the stool beside him, and they were just 2 people at the end of a long first day, in a room that smelled like coffee and jalapeno cornbread and fresh paint, and with a mural on the wall and a jukebox that worked and chairs left on the floor, because the place wasn't bracing against anything anymore. And he said, "Maya, what? The first day I came in. When you brought the coffee to the booth, he was quiet for a moment. I almost said something. Almost told you to walk away, that I had it handled, that it wasn't your concern. Why didn't you?" He thought about it genuinely, and, "Because you'd already decided," he said. "The moment you set down the coffee pot and turned around, you'd already decided. There wasn't anything I could have said that would have mattered." And she was quiet. "Were you right?" she said. "Did you have it handled?" A long pause. "No," he said. She nodded. They sat for a while in the quiet of the closed diner, the street outside dark and still, the Georgia night pressing softly against the windows. and the mural on the wall held its figures in whatever light remained. People standing, not heroes, not in the middle of any dramatic moment, just standing in the space that was theirs, in the ordinary light of an ordinary room. And she said, "Same time next Tuesday?" He said, "Any table?" "Any table," she said. "We're past the back corner." He made the small sound that was as close as he got to a laugh. She stood up, got her jacket from behind the counter, and felt the notebook in the inside pocket and the card beside it, both of them there. She looked at the room one more time, the chairs on the floor, the counter with its stools, and the mural, the window, the jukebox silent now but capable of playing all the way through without getting stuck. She turned off the last light. She went out the front door. The bell rang behind her. The street was quiet, and September had finally let go, and there was real autumn in the air now, the kind that smelled like something deciding to change. The neon sign flickered once, then it held, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and put her hands in her jacket pockets, and felt the corner of the notebook against her fingers. And she thought about Monday, about enrollment deadlines and evening sessions, and what it meant to finally name the road you'd been walking. She thought about Tommy's back, straightening. She thought about the jukebox, finally fixed. She started walking, and the street was dark and quiet, and Harlow Creek was exactly what it had always been, and also in some way that wouldn't photograph or translate, genuinely different. The difference lived in the small things, in what people said when they saw each other now, and in what they didn't say. In the particular quality of a room where something broken had been repaired, and the repair was visible, and nobody was pretending otherwise. She walked through it, and the night air was cool, and she was tired in the good way, the way that meant something had been done, not just endured. She walked home. She kept going.